The tank destroyer. The abandoned Jagdpanzer sat like a steel gravestone in the snow-covered field. Its long barrel pointed toward the German lines that stretched across the Vosges Mountains. Second Lieutenant Audie Murphy studied it through his field glasses, noting how the morning frost had turned its camouflaged hull into a perfect mirror of the frozen landscape around them. 3 weeks into January 1945, everything in this part of eastern France seemed locked in ice. The trees, the roads, even the breath that hung in white clouds around the faces of his men. Company L had been holding this stretch of forest road for 6 days now, part of the 3rd Infantry Division's broader push to clear German forces from their winter positions in the Vosges Mountains. The cold was killing almost as many men as enemy fire, turning simple tasks like loading ammunition or operating radio equipment into exercises in endurance. Murphy's platoon occupied a series of shallow foxholes carved from the frozen earth, connected by narrow communication trenches that filled with snow faster than they could be cleared. The intelligence briefing that morning had been typically optimistic. Battalion claimed the German forces facing them were demoralized rearguard units, falling back toward the Rhine in disorder. But Murphy had been fighting in these mountains long enough to know that the enemy positions across that field were anything but disorganized. He could see the disciplined spacing of their fighting positions, the careful fields of fire they had prepared, the way they moved only at night and kept perfect camouflage discipline during daylight hours. Sergeant First Class Tony Rodriguez crawled up beside him, snow crunching under his elbows as he settled into position behind the fallen log that served as their forward observation post. Rodriguez had been with the 15th Infantry Regiment since Sicily, and his weathered face showed the accumulated fatigue of 2 years of continuous combat. He followed Murphy's gaze toward the disabled tank destroyer, then shook his head slowly. "That thing's been sitting there for 3 days now, Lieutenant. Krauts probably stripped it clean before they pulled back to their new line." Murphy lowered his binoculars, considering. The Jagdpanzer IV had been knocked out during the initial assault on this position, probably by American artillery or fighter bombers. Its crew had long since disappeared, either killed, captured, or evacuated back to German lines. But something about the vehicle's position nagged at him. It sat perfectly centered between the American and German positions, offering potential cover for movement in either direction. The radio in their makeshift command post crackled with static, then cleared enough to carry the voice of Captain James Harrison from company headquarters. The message was brief and unwelcome: new orders from battalion. Company L was to advance across the open ground at 1400 hours, secure the crossroads beyond the German positions, and establish blocking positions to prevent enemy reinforcements from reaching the main defensive line 5 kilometers to the east. Murphy exchanged glances with Rodriguez. They both knew what advancing across that field would mean. The German positions were expertly sited to create interlocking fields of fire across every possible approach. The frozen ground would make digging in nearly impossible, and the snow would highlight every moving figure against the dark earth. It was the kind of operation that looked simple on a map and turned into a slaughter when real men tried to execute it. "Sir," Rodriguez said quietly, "we've got maybe 30 effective rifles left in the platoon. Half the men are dealing with frostbite, and Private Collins hasn't been able to feel his feet since yesterday. We advance across that open ground in daylight, and we're going to lose a lot of good people." Murphy nodded, but he also understood the larger tactical picture. The 3rd Infantry Division was racing against time and weather, trying to maintain pressure on German forces before the next major winter storm locked everything in place for days or weeks. Every day they delayed gave the enemy more time to consolidate their positions and bring up reserves from deeper inside Germany. The sound of incoming artillery interrupted his thoughts. German 80mm shells began landing in the woods behind them, searching for American supply lines and command posts. The barrage was methodical and professional, walking slowly through the forest in a pattern designed to catch trucks, radio stations, and ammunition dumps. Murphy and his men pressed themselves deeper into their foxholes, feeling the ground shake with each impact and listening to the whistle and crack of shrapnel through the pine trees. When the shelling stopped, Murphy found himself staring again at that abandoned tank destroyer. Something about its gun elevation caught his attention. The long 75mm cannon was still traversed toward the German lines, and from this angle it appeared that the barrel was intact. If the fighting compartment wasn't completely destroyed, if there were still high-explosive rounds in the ammunition storage, if the firing mechanism was still functional, those were a lot of ifs. But they added up to a possibility that might change the tactical equation. Private First Class Danny Kerrigan slid down into the observation post, his 19-year-old face pinched with cold and exhaustion. Kerrigan had joined the platoon just before Christmas, a replacement from the latest group of reinforcements shipped over from stateside training camps. He carried himself with the nervous energy of someone who hadn't yet learned to distinguish between the sounds of incoming and outgoing artillery. "Lieutenant," he said, breathing hard from his sprint between positions, "Sergeant Mills wants to know if we're really going to try crossing that field this afternoon. The men are asking questions." Murphy understood the questions behind the question. His soldiers trusted him, but they also knew that following orders blindly could get them all killed for no tactical gain. They wanted to know that their 20-year-old lieutenant had a plan beyond walking directly into German machine gun fire. As he watched, a single rifle shot cracked from the German positions, followed immediately by the distinctive sound of an American carbine returning fire. Some nervous sentry on one side or the other, probably seeing movement that wasn't there, but the exchange reminded Murphy that they were all balanced on the edge of violence, waiting for someone to make the first decisive move. The abandoned Jagdpanzer continued to dominate his thinking. 200 yards of open ground separated their positions from that steel shelter. 200 yards under the guns of an experienced enemy who had been watching every blade of grass in that field for days. But if someone could reach it, if the main gun could be made to fire, it might provide the covering fire necessary to get his men across that killing zone alive. If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation, and stay with us for the next chapters. The attack order came with typical military precision. Advance at 1400 hours, secure objectives Alpha through Charlie, establish communications with battalion no later than 1600. What the order didn't mention was the reality facing Company L, 37 effective soldiers, ammunition running low, and no supporting artillery available due to supply problems further up the mountain roads. Murphy gathered his squad leaders in a shallow depression behind their forward positions, using a shelter half stretched between two pine trees to keep the snow off his maps. The terrain looked deceptively simple on paper. Open field, small stream, low ridge, crowned with the crossroads they needed to take. But Murphy had learned to read ground with his eyes, not just with topographic symbols. Sergeant Mills, a steady veteran from Oklahoma, pointed toward the German positions with a gloved finger that had been frostbitten twice since New Year's Day. "They've got at least 2 machine gun positions covering the main approaches, Lieutenant. Maybe more, and that rise gives them perfect observation over everything we need to cross." Staff Sergeant Pete Crawford, whose squad had been reduced to 8 men after yesterday's patrol contact, studied the abandoned Jagdpanzer through his own field glasses. "That tank destroyer's been bothering me too, sir. It's positioned like they want us to think about using it for cover. Could be a trap." Murphy had considered the same possibility. German forces in the Vosges Mountains had proven expert at setting ambushes, using everything from disabled vehicles to apparently abandoned positions to lure American troops into carefully prepared killing zones. But something about this situation felt different. The tank destroyer's position was too obvious for a trap, too perfectly placed to be accidental. The radio operator, Corporal James Walsh, crawled over to report the latest communication from company headquarters. Captain Harrison wanted a detailed reconnaissance of German positions before the attack commenced. He also passed along intelligence that suggested enemy forces in this sector were preparing to withdraw further east, possibly abandoning their current positions within 24 hours. Murphy almost smiled at that last piece of information. In his experience, intelligence reports about German withdrawal plans were usually wrong by exactly 180 degrees. When headquarters claimed the enemy was retreating, they were usually digging in deeper. When reports suggested light resistance, that's when his men walked into the heaviest fighting. Private Kerrigan returned from his circuit of the platoon positions, carrying reports from each squad leader. The news wasn't encouraging. Ammunition was down to less than 60 rounds per rifle, with only a dozen grenades left in the entire platoon. 3 men were running fevers from various infections, and 2 others showed early signs of trench foot that would require medical attention within hours. But what worried Murphy most was the look in his soldiers' eyes. These weren't green replacements anymore. They had been fighting in the Vosges Mountains for over a month, and they understood exactly what crossing that open field would cost. They would follow his orders because that's what soldiers did. But they deserved to know that someone had thought beyond the simple directive to advance and secure. The German artillery started up again around noon, a systematic barrage that suggested forward observers were calling in precise coordinates on American positions. Murphy noticed that the rounds were landing in a specific pattern, designed to cut off likely withdrawal routes rather than destroy the forward foxholes. It was the kind of preparatory fire that preceded a German counterattack, not the random harassment they had been receiving for the past week. Rodriguez slid back into the command post, his face grim with new intelligence gathered from listening posts along their perimeter. "Sir, we've got movement on the German side. Not withdrawal, reinforcement. Sounds like at least a squad, maybe more, moving up to their main line during the barrage." This changed everything. Instead of facing demoralized rear guards, Company L would be attacking fresh troops in prepared positions. The tactical mathematics suddenly looked even worse than Murphy had initially calculated. But as he studied that abandoned Jagdpanzer one more time, Murphy began to see possibilities rather than just obstacles. The vehicle sat at the perfect angle to bring fire to bear on the German machine gun positions. Its thick armor would provide protection from small arms fire and shell fragments. Most importantly, it was positioned to offer covering fire for the exact route his men would need to take to reach their objectives. The key question was whether the main gun was still functional. German crews were usually thorough about destroying equipment before abandoning it, but the tank destroyer had been knocked out during active fighting. There might not have been time for proper demolition procedures. Sergeant Mills noticed the direction of Murphy's gaze and shook his head slowly. "Lieutenant, that's 200 yards of open ground with no cover except shell holes, and even if you made it, even if the gun works, you'd be alone out there against everything they can throw at you." Murphy was already checking his rifle and gathering extra ammunition from the men around him. The plan was taking shape in his mind, driven less by tactical doctrine than by the simple understanding that doing nothing would get more of his men killed than taking action. The morning patrol reports had confirmed what he suspected about German positions. They had constructed their defense in depth, with the main resistance line anchored on that low ridge beyond the crossroads. But they had also positioned advanced fighting positions closer to the American line, specifically to catch any attacking force in a crossfire before they could reach the primary objectives. Walsh looked up from his radio, static crackling around his voice as he relayed the latest message from battalion. "Sir, headquarters wants to know if we need additional time to prepare for the assault. They're asking about casualties and ammunition status." Murphy considered his response carefully. He could request a delay, cite the ammunition shortage and the evidence of German reinforcement. Battalion might approve a postponement, might even assign the mission to another company with more effective strength. But that would mean another day of watching his men slowly freeze in these positions. Another night of German patrols probing their defences, another 24 hours for the enemy to improve their positions and bring up more troops. The abandoned tank destroyer continued to dominate his tactical thinking. It represented risk, certainly, but it also represented the only realistic chance of getting his platoon across that field with acceptable casualties. Someone would have to reach it, someone would have to determine if the main gun could be made functional, and someone would have to stay with it long enough to provide effective covering fire. The rumour mill along the Vosges mountain front worked faster than official communications. By 1300 hours, word had filtered down through the 3rd Infantry Division that other companies were facing similar situations. Impossible orders, impossible ground, impossible odds. Some units were reporting that German resistance was stiffening rather than weakening, with evidence of fresh troops and new equipment moving into defensive positions all along the line. Murphy listened to fragments of radio traffic from adjacent units, catching enough to understand that Company L wasn't alone in questioning the wisdom of afternoon attacks across open ground. But orders remained orders, and 1400 hours was approaching whether the tactical situation made sense or not. Private First Class Robert Chen, the platoon's most experienced machine gunner, approached the command post with his assistant gunner, both men carrying the disassembled pieces of their .30 caliber Browning. Chen had been with Murphy since the fighting outside Marseille, and his steady competence under fire had kept the platoon alive through a dozen impossible situations. "Lieutenant," Chen said quietly, "we've got maybe 200 rounds left for the machine gun, not enough for sustained covering fire if things go bad out there. And the Germans know exactly where we are. They've been watching our positions for a week." The tactical mathematics were brutal and simple. Murphy's men would be advancing across ground that the enemy had studied, measured, and prepared to defend. Every fold in the earth that might offer cover had been registered by German artillery. Every approach route had been calculated for fields of fire. The abandoned Jagdpanzer was the only element in the equation that might offer surprise rather than predictable slaughter. Sergeant Rodriguez returned from his final reconnaissance of German positions, moving carefully through the communication trenches to avoid sniper observation. His report confirmed Murphy's worst suspicions about what they were facing. "Sir, they've got the field divided into sectors, probably pre-registered for mortar fire. At least 3 machine gun positions that I can identify, positioned to catch us in a crossfire about halfway across. And they've been improving their positions. Fresh earth, new camouflage. These aren't troops getting ready to withdraw." The radio crackled with Captain Harrison's voice, requesting final status reports before the attack commenced. Murphy keyed the handset, choosing his words carefully. "Company headquarters, this is Red 6. Platoon ready to advance on schedule. Request confirmation of artillery support availability." The response came back negative. Artillery was committed to supporting operations further south, and air support remained grounded due to weather conditions throughout the Vosges Mountains. Company L would be attacking with only what they could carry and whatever covering fire they could provide for each other. Walsh looked up from the radio set, his young face troubled by what he was hearing on the command net. "Lieutenant, I'm picking up German radio traffic. They know we're coming. They're talking about interlocking fire zones and target registration. Sir, they're ready for us." Murphy had been studying the abandoned tank destroyer for so long that he could visualize every detail of its construction. The Jagdpanzer IV carried a 75mm PaK-42 gun, capable of firing both armor-piercing and high-explosive rounds. Its fighting compartment was heavily armored against return fire, and its low profile would make it a difficult target for German anti-tank weapons. If the vehicle's ammunition storage was intact, if the firing mechanism hadn't been sabotaged, It could deliver the kind of precise, heavy fire that might suppress German positions long enough for infantry to close the distance. The plan, crystallizing in Murphy's mind, violated every principle of small unit tactics he had been taught. It required splitting his force, sending one man across open ground alone and depending on a piece of abandoned enemy equipment that might not function when needed. But conventional tactics weren't going to work against the defensive positions facing them, and following orders, exactly as written, would result in casualties the platoon couldn't afford. Staff Sergeant Crawford approached with the latest reports from his squad leaders. His men had been watching German positions through improvised periscopes, noting movement patterns and trying to identify specific weapon emplacements. "Lieutenant, they've got this planned out perfectly. Soon as we leave our holes, they'll cut us apart before we make it 50 yards. But Crawford also noticed something else. The German positions were focused on the obvious approaches across the open field. They had prepared their defensive fires for a conventional infantry assault, not for the possibility that someone might reach that abandoned tank destroyer and turn its gun against them. Murphy made his decision with the understanding that leadership sometimes meant accepting responsibility for plans that no textbook would recommend. The risk was enormous, but doing nothing guaranteed a level of casualties that would effectively eliminate his platoon as a fighting unit. "Crawford," Murphy said, "I want you to take over the platoon when I move out. Wait for my signal before you start the assault. And if something happens to me out there, fall back to the secondary positions and wait for company to come up with a different plan." The silence that followed told Murphy everything he needed to know about how his men viewed the plan taking shape. They understood the mathematics as clearly as he did, and they knew that someone was going to have to take an almost impossible risk to give the rest of them any chance at all. Sergeant Mills broke the silence with a question that had been bothering him since morning. "Sir, what makes you think that Jagdpanzer's gun is still functional? Germans usually wreck everything before they abandon it." Murphy had considered the same question, and his answer was based more on hope than tactical intelligence. The tank destroyer had been knocked out during active fighting, probably by American aircraft or artillery. Its crew might have been killed or wounded before they could properly destroy the vehicle. There might have been time only to evacuate personnel, not to conduct thorough demolition procedures. The radio crackled one final time with Captain Harrison's voice. "All red elements, execute phase line Charlie at 1400 hours. Good hunting." Murphy checked his watch. 13:55 hours, 5 minutes to 0 hour, and the longest sprint of his life. Would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. At exactly 1400 hours, Murphy left the safety of his foxhole and began the sprint that would either save his platoon or end his war. The first 50 yards across the frozen field felt like moving through a nightmare, every step expected to be his last, every breath waiting for the crack of German rifles that would mean discovery and death. The snow crunched under his boots despite his efforts to move quietly, and the white ground made camouflage impossible. But the German positions remained silent during those initial moments, suggesting that his movement had gone undetected, or that enemy observers were waiting for him to reach a predetermined killing zone. Murphy used every shell crater and fold in the ground for concealment, following a zigzag route that avoided the most obvious lines of approach. His rifle felt impossibly heavy during the sprint, and the extra ammunition he carried seemed to catch on every piece of equipment. But somehow he covered the distance without drawing fire, reaching the abandoned Jagdpanzer as German voices began shouting from their positions. The tank destroyer's crew compartment was cramped and filled with frozen equipment, but the main gun appeared intact. Murphy found high explosive rounds still secured in their storage racks, and the firing mechanism showed no obvious signs of sabotage. The German crew had apparently been forced to abandon their vehicle quickly, without time for proper demolition procedures. The first German machine gun opened fire as Murphy struggled to traverse the 75mm gun toward their positions. Bullets sparked off the Jagdpanzer's armor plating while he worked to understand the firing controls and load the first round. The vehicle's thick steel protection kept him alive during those crucial moments, but he knew that German infantry would soon be maneuvering to attack him with Panzerfausts or satchel charges. His first shot was high, sailing over the German machine gun position and exploding harmlessly in the trees behind it. But the sound of the 75mm gun got everyone's attention, and suddenly Murphy found himself the primary target for every German weapon that could bear on his position. Rifle fire and machine gun bursts hammered against the tank destroyer's hull while he reloaded and adjusted his aim. The second shot was better, landing close enough to the nearest machine gun nest to silence it temporarily and give his men their first glimpse of hope. Murphy could see figures moving in the German positions, could hear shouted orders and the sound of equipment being repositioned to deal with this unexpected threat from their flank. For 30 minutes, Murphy fought a private war from inside that abandoned vehicle, using its main gun and his personal rifle to keep German heads down while his platoon began their advance across the open field. He watched through the gun sight as Staff Sergeant Crawford led the first squad forward, moving from shell crater to shell crater while Murphy provided covering fire. The German response was immediate and professional. Mortar rounds began falling around the Jagdpanzer, trying to disable the vehicle or force Murphy to abandon his position. When that failed, they brought up a Panzerschreck team and began firing anti-tank rockets that exploded against the armor with tremendous concussion, but failed to penetrate the fighting compartment. Murphy's ammunition was running low, and his ears were ringing from the constant noise of impact and explosion. But he could see that his fire was having the desired effect. German positions that had been impregnable against infantry assault were vulnerable to direct fire from a 75mm gun at close range. Each high-explosive round forced enemy gunners to take cover, giving his men precious seconds to advance. Private Kerrigan reached the tank destroyer first, sliding behind its steel bulk as German fire continued to rake the area. He carried extra ammunition for Murphy's rifle and a field telephone that Crawford hoped might allow better coordination between the Jagdpanzer and the advancing infantry. "Lieutenant," Kerrigan shouted over the sound of incoming fire, "Sergeant Crawford says to tell you that he's got one squad across the stream and moving up the slope, but they're taking casualties and they need you to keep that gun firing." Murphy was already loading another high-explosive round, his hands working automatically despite the noise and confusion around him. The German mortar fire was getting more accurate, and he knew it was only a matter of time before they scored a direct hit on something vital or brought up heavier weapons that could penetrate the Jagdpanzer's armor. But through the gun sight, he could see American soldiers moving steadily across ground that had seemed impossible just an hour earlier. Chen had set up his machine gun in a shell crater and was providing covering fire for the second squad. Rodriguez was leading a small group along the stream bed, using the depression for concealment as they worked their way toward the German right flank. The tactical situation was developing in Company L's favor, but Murphy understood that success would depend on maintaining suppressive fire for at least another 20 minutes. Long enough for his men to close the distance and assault the German positions with grenades and small arms fire. A Panzerfaust rocket exploded against the Jagdpanzer's gun mantlet, showering Murphy with steel fragments and temporary blindness. For a moment he thought the main gun had been disabled, but when his vision cleared, he found that the firing mechanism was still functional. The German anti-tank teams were getting closer, and their aim was improving with each shot. Murphy's next shot scattered a German squad that was trying to set up a machine gun in a new position. He could see enemy soldiers running between positions, could hear officers shouting orders as they tried to coordinate their defense against an attack that was developing differently than they had planned. The abandoned tank destroyer had become the pivot point for the entire engagement, allowing Murphy to deliver precise fire against targets that were perfectly positioned to slaughter advancing infantry, but vulnerable to direct fire from an unexpected direction. Each round he fired bought time and space for his men to continue their advance, but each shot also drew more attention and heavier fire onto his position. When Corporal Walsh reached the Jagdpanzer with his radio, Murphy could finally coordinate with Captain Harrison and request the artillery support that had been unavailable earlier. But even as he called in fire missions on German reserve positions, Murphy knew that the real work was being done by the men who had followed him across that impossible field. The central secret of that afternoon in the Vosges Mountains was not what appeared in the after-action report 3 days later. The citation would describe precise fire, tactical innovation, and successful assault on a defended position. What it would not mention was the 15 minutes when Murphy sat alone in that Jagdpanzer, hands shaking uncontrollably, unable to load another round, while German infantry closed to within grenade range of his position. The breakdown came without warning, sometime after his 6th high-explosive round and before Staff Sergeant Crawford's squad reached the German wire. Murphy's hands simply stopped working, trembling so violently that he couldn't manipulate the firing controls or even hold his rifle steady. For those endless minutes, he crouched in the fighting compartment while bullets sparked off the armor around him, paralyzed by the accumulated fear and exhaustion of too many impossible situations. It was Private Kerrigan who brought him back. The 19-year-old replacement from stateside had crawled underneath the Jagdpanzer during a particularly intense burst of machine gun fire, and he stayed there talking to Murphy through the open hatch, not about tactics or ammunition or the advancing infantry, but about a girl named Susan back in Ohio and the letters he wrote every night before falling asleep in his foxhole. "Lieutenant," Kerrigan said quietly, "I know you're scared. We're all scared. But Sergeant Rodriguez is pinned down about 100 yards out, and Chen's machine gun is jammed. If you can fire one more round at that position on the right, I think Crawford's squad can get through." The words penetrated Murphy's paralysis in a way that orders or tactical necessity hadn't. Someone needed him to function, not as a legend or a hero, but as a soldier with a job to do for other soldiers who were depending on him. His hands steadied enough to load another round, traverse the gun, and send high-explosive death into the German position that was keeping his men pinned down. But the moment of breakdown had cost precious time and ammunition. German reinforcements were arriving from their reserve positions, and Murphy could see fresh troops moving to outflank the American advance. The tactical window was closing, and his men were still too far from their objectives to guarantee success. What followed was the longest hour of sustained combat Murphy had experienced since Sicily. He fired every remaining high-explosive round in the Jagdpanzer's ammunition storage, then used his rifle to engage German infantry who were trying to approach his position with explosive charges. When his rifle ammunition ran low, he borrowed grenades from Kerrigan and Walsh, who had both reached the relative safety of the tank destroyer's hull. The German counterattack came in 2 waves. First, a squad of infantry trying to eliminate the Jagdpanzer with Panzerfausts and satchel charges. Then, a more coordinated assault designed to retake their original positions before American reinforcements could arrive. Murphy found himself fighting targets at ranges from 10 yards to 400, using everything from hand grenades to the tank destroyer's machine gun to keep enemy forces away from his position. But what stayed with him afterward wasn't the sound of gunfire or the smell of cordite and burning metal. It was the silence that followed when the last German position fell to Crawford's assault, and Murphy realized that he had survived another impossible situation that should have killed him. The cost was written in faces rather than numbers. Rodriguez had taken shrapnel from a German grenade and would be evacuated to a field hospital within hours. Chen's machine gun team had suffered 1 killed and 1 wounded. Private Martinez, who had been with the platoon since Marseille, was missing and presumed captured after his squad became separated during the final assault. Captain Harrison arrived with the rest of Company L just as German artillery began falling on their newly captured positions. The timing was perfect, exactly what Murphy had hoped for when he began his sprint toward that abandoned tank destroyer. But Harrison's congratulations felt hollow when measured against the price his men had paid for tactical success. The after-action report would record the engagement as a successful assault on defended German positions, with enemy casualties estimated at 15 to 20 and American losses described as light. It would mention the innovative use of captured equipment and the aggressive leadership that had turned a potentially costly frontal assault into a tactical victory. What the report would not mention was Murphy's breakdown, or the way Kerrigan's calm voice had brought him back from paralysis, or the fact that success had depended as much on German mistakes as American courage. It would not describe the randomness that had kept Murphy alive while better soldiers died, or the guilt that came with surviving when others didn't. Years later, when people asked Murphy about the day he captured a German tank destroyer and used it to break up an enemy defensive position, he would give them the version from the citation: precise, heroic, clean. He never mentioned the shaking hands or the teenager from Ohio who had talked him through the worst moment of his war. The abandoned Jagdpanzer sat in that field for another week before American engineers finally removed it. Local French civilians told stories about the morning they watched one American soldier fight an entire German company from inside an enemy tank. The stories grew with each telling, as stories do, until they bore little resemblance to what had actually happened. But Murphy kept the truth locked away with all his other secrets from the war. The moments of terror, the times when luck mattered more than courage, the faces of men who didn't make it home. Those memories were heavier than any medal and harder to carry than any citation could express. The evacuation helicopter lifted off from the aid station, clearing 3 hours after the engagement ended, carrying Rodriguez and 2 other wounded men back to a field hospital near Strasbourg. Murphy watched it disappear into the grey winter sky over the Vosges Mountains, then returned to the routine work of consolidating defensive positions and preparing for the next German counterattack. Company L had gained perhaps 800 yards of frozen ground and a crossroads that would appear on maps as a minor tactical victory. The cost had been measured in good men who wouldn't see the end of winter, in wounds that would heal badly in the cold, and in the accumulation of stress that was wearing down every soldier in the 3rd Infantry Division. Staff Sergeant Crawford approached Murphy's new command post, a shallow depression behind the German positions they had overrun that afternoon. He carried the platoon's casualty report and requests for ammunition resupply, but his expression suggested that personnel matters were weighing on him more than logistics. "Lieutenant," Crawford said quietly, "the men are asking questions about what happens next. They know we can't keep this up indefinitely. Everyone's running on empty." Murphy understood the questions his soldiers weren't asking directly. How many more impossible situations could they survive? How long before their luck ran out completely? When would the war finally end? And would any of them be alive to see it? The radio brought news from other units fighting in the Vosges Mountains. Company A had been forced to withdraw from positions they had held for 2 weeks. Company K was reporting heavy German reinforcement along their sector. Battalion was requesting detailed intelligence on enemy troop movements and defensive preparations, but the radio also carried stranger reports, fragments of information about German forces beginning to pull back from advanced positions, about supply problems in enemy rear areas, about prisoners who spoke of low morale and equipment shortages. The war was grinding towards some kind of conclusion, though no one could predict when or how the ending would come. Private Kerrigan returned from his evening rounds with reports from the men manning their new defensive line. The soldiers were settling into the familiar routine of digging in, improving positions, and preparing for another night of listening posts and patrol activity. But Kerrigan's quiet confidence had changed since that afternoon. He carried himself with the steadiness that came from having been tested under fire. "Sir," Kerrigan said, "Sergeant Mills wanted me to ask about replacement procedures. We're down to about 20 effective rifles, and headquarters is asking when we'll be ready for the next operation." The question behind the question was whether Company L would be pulled back for rest and refit, or whether they would continue operations with whatever men and equipment they could scrape together. Murphy had seen other units ground down to ineffective strength by continuous combat, their experienced soldiers replaced by fresh reinforcements who had to learn battlefield lessons that couldn't be taught in training camps. As darkness settled over the battlefield, Murphy found himself thinking about that abandoned Jagdpanzer and what it had meant to the day's fighting. The tank destroyer had been a tool, nothing more, a piece of equipment that had happened to be in the right place when someone needed it. But it had also become something larger in the stories his men would tell, a symbol of individual courage prevailing against impossible odds. The truth, as Murphy understood it, was more complicated and less satisfying than the legend would become. Success had depended on German mistakes, American luck, and the accumulated skills of soldiers who had been fighting together long enough to function under extreme stress. The tank destroyer had provided the means, but the real victory belonged to men like Rodriguez and Chen and Crawford, who had followed a dangerous plan because they trusted their lieutenant to bring them through alive. 20 years later, sitting in a small apartment in Hollywood, Murphy would try to explain to a magazine writer what that afternoon had actually felt like. But the words never came out right. How could he describe the weight of other people's lives in your hands? How could he make someone understand the guilt that came with surviving when better men didn't? The writer wanted stories about heroism and courage, about the moments when ordinary Americans rose to extraordinary challenges. He wanted clean narratives with clear moral lessons, tales that would inspire readers and validate their faith in American values. Murphy gave him some of that because it was easier than trying to explain the contradictions. He described the tactical situation, the decision to use captured equipment, the successful assault on German positions. He mentioned the wounded being evacuated and the ground gained. He kept it simple and focused on results rather than the process that achieved them. What he didn't mention was the shaking hands, or the way Private Kerrigan's voice had brought him back from paralysis, or the random chance that had kept German artillery from scoring a direct hit during those crucial minutes. He didn't try to explain how courage and terror could exist in the same moment, or how leadership sometimes meant accepting responsibility for plans that should have failed. The abandoned tank destroyer had been scrapped years ago, melted down and turned into farm equipment or construction steel. But in Murphy's memory, it remained exactly as it had been that afternoon, a steel shelter in a frozen field, offering protection and the means to fight back against overwhelming odds. The magazine story appeared 6 months later, describing the incident in terms that made it sound cleaner and more heroic than it had felt at the time. Readers wrote letters praising Murphy's courage and asking for more details about his wartime service. He answered some of them, but never quite honestly. The real story remained locked away with all his other secrets from the war, the faces of men who didn't come home, the sound of artillery that still woke him at night, the knowledge that survival often came down to luck rather than virtue. Those were the memories that no citation could capture and no medal could balance. If this story reminded you that behind every medal there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.